Assume breach, designed for the inside out. Opening, the wall that was never enough. For most of computing history, security was imagined as a castle. Build high walls, dig a wide moat, post guards at the gate, and the people inside are safe. The logic is intuitive, and the metaphor is old enough that it shaped the architecture of the earliest firewalls. If you could control what entered the network, you could control what happened inside it. The perimeter was the security program. Everything inside it was, by assumption, trustworthy. The assumption was always wrong. It just took decades for the consequences to become undeniable. The attackers who compromised RSA security in 2011 did not batter down the perimeter. They sent a phishing email to a small group of employees, one of whom opened an attached spreadsheet, which executed a zero-day exploit and installed a remote access tool on their workstation. The attacker was inside. The wall was still standing. Once inside, they spent weeks moving quietly through the internal network, mapping systems, elevating privileges, and ultimately extracting the seed values for secure ID tokens. The very tokens that were being used to protect the perimeters of defense contractors, financial institutions, and government agencies that trusted RSA's products. The moat was irrelevant. The guards at the gate had nothing to report. The threat had already passed them, wearing the credentials of an employee who opened the wrong email on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday. That is the failure that this principle is designed to prevent from being catastrophic, not the initial compromise. No security program can guarantee that an attacker will never find a way in. The failure is what happens after the initial compromise, when an organization whose entire security model was built on keeping attackers out discovers that it has almost no defenses for the moment the attacker is already standing in the hallway. The doors between rooms are unlocked. The filing cabinets are open. The backup drives are on the same shelf as the primary ones. The administrator's credentials are the same ones the attacker found in the compromised workstation's cached memory. Assume breach is not a counsel of despair. It is not an instruction to stop trying to prevent intrusions. It is a design philosophy. Build your security architecture as though the attacker is already inside, because at some point they will be, and when that moment arrives, what you built before it happens is the only thing that determines whether the outcome is a contained incident or an existential crisis. The foundation, what the perimeter was never designed to solve. Before the design philosophy can be applied, the vocabulary of what happens after initial access needs to be precise, because the gap between knowing these terms and being able to diagnose them in real time is where most security programs find themselves inadequate. The incident response lifecycle, as defined by NIST Special Publication 800-61, has 4 phases. Preparation is everything that happens before an incident. The policies, the playbooks, the tools deployed, the training conducted, the backups maintained, and the communication trees established. Detection and analysis is the work of recognizing that an incident has occurred and characterizing it. What systems are affected? What is the likely attack vector? How long has the attacker been present? And what is the scope of the damage so far? Containment, eradication, and recovery is the active response phase, stopping the spread, removing the attacker's presence, and restoring normal operation. Post-incident activity is the retrospective. What did we learn? What failed? What do we change before the next one? The traditional perimeter-focused security model invested almost exclusively in preparation, specifically in the subset of preparation concerned with preventing detection and analysis from ever needing to be triggered. The assumption was that if the firewall rules were right, the email gateway was filtering correctly and the VPN was requiring strong authentication, the attacker would never get in and the IR lifecycle would never need to be activated. The result was organizations with sophisticated perimeter investments and almost no capacity to execute the containment, eradication, and recovery phase when the perimeter was inevitably bypassed. Assume breach inverts the investment priority. It says, spend on preparation, but define preparation to include the tools, processes, and architecture decisions that make containment, eradication, and recovery fast, contained, and survivable. Not instead of perimeter in addition to it. The perimeter is still worth having. It raises the attacker's cost and reduces the frequency of initial access events. But it is not sufficient on its own, and the organization that is only the perimeter is the one that discovers 6 months after a breach that the attacker has been living quietly in the network since the day they got through the gate. Network segmentation is the architectural manifestation of this philosophy at the network layer. A flat network, one in which every device can reach every other device, is the attacker's paradise. An attacker who compromises a marketing workstation in a flat network can reach the finance servers, the HR database, the backup infrastructure, the domain controllers, and the network management systems without crossing any internal barrier. Lateral movement in a flat network is not a sophisticated capability. It is the default behavior of networking. Packets go where they are addressed, and if there are no rules restricting where they can be addressed, they can go anywhere. Segmentation divides the network into zones defined by the data they hold and the trust level of the devices in them. User workstations live in a workstation segment. Servers live in a server segment. Payment systems live in a payment card data environment. Domain controllers live in an identity services segment. Management systems live in a management network accessible only from specific authorized management workstations. Each zone has firewalls or access control rules that define which communications are permitted to cross segment boundaries, and everything not explicitly permitted is denied. An attacker who compromises a workstation in the user segment and attempts to reach the database server in the server segment is stopped at the segment boundary. Not because the attacker's technique was ineffective, but because the architecture does not permit that connection to succeed. Zero trust is the logical extension of this principle applied to identity rather than to network location. Traditional access control models granted trust based on where you were. If you were on the internal network, you were trusted. If you were outside, you were not. Zero trust recognizes that location is not a reliable indicator of trustworthiness. An attacker who has compromised an internal device is on the internal network and has inherited all the trust that the network location conferred. Zero trust replaces location-based trust with continuous, identity-based verification. Every request to access every resource is authenticated, authorized against a policy, and evaluated against context. Who is the user? What device are they using? What is the posture of that device? Where are they accessing from? And is this request consistent with their normal behavior before access is granted? Trust is not inherited. It is earned at every transaction. The relationship between network segmentation and zero trust is not competitive. Segmentation is a coarse-grained control that limits the blast radius of a compromise to the segment where it occurs. Zero trust is a fine-grained control that limits the blast radius to the specific resources the compromised identity is authorized to reach. Both operating together produce an environment where an attacker who compromises a workstation and a valid credential can reach only the resources that credential is explicitly permitted to access, and nothing else. The structural tension, internal friction versus attacker friction. The tension at the center of assumed breach is one that security engineers feel acutely and business stakeholders feel through their productivity. The same controls that make lateral movement difficult for an attacker make legitimate administrative work more complex. A segmented network that requires JIT access tokens to cross zone boundaries will also require an IT administrator to request a token before they can reach a server in a different segment. A behavioral detection rule that fires on PowerShell scripts invoking network connections will also fire on the IT team's patch management scripts. A PAM solution that vaults credentials and records all privileged sessions adds friction to every administrative task that previously took 3 keystrokes. This tension is real and must be designed for, not dismissed. An assumed breach architecture that imposes so much friction on legitimate operations that administrators create workarounds, shared accounts to avoid the session recording, exceptions to the segmentation policy for operational efficiency, detection rules suppressed because they alert too frequently, has not secured the environment. It has driven the security gaps underground where they are invisible. The workarounds become the actual attack surface. The resolution to this tension is not to reduce the controls. It is to design the controls so that the friction falls more heavily on attacker behavior than on legitimate behavior. An attacker performing lateral movement and a system administrator performing legitimate maintenance look different in meaningful ways if the detection rules are well designed. The administrator's actions follow a known pattern. They are associated with a change ticket. They occur during business hours. They originate from an authorized management workstation. They access a predictable set of systems, and they stop when the maintenance task is complete. The attacker's actions differ in at least one of these dimensions. They may have a change ticket if they have compromised the ticketing system, but they are less likely to have originated from the correct management workstation or to be accessing systems that are consistent with the maintenance scenario the ticket describes, or to stop when the legitimate maintenance window closes. Purple teaming, collaborative exercises where the red team simulates attacker behavior inside the perimeter and the blue team practices detecting and responding to it, is the operational discipline that calibrates this balance. A detection rule that fires on every PowerShell invocation is useless because the alert volume destroys the signal. A detection rule that fires on PowerShell invocations that create network connections to external IPs are invoked by non-standard parent processes and occur outside business hours on endpoints that have not generated that pattern before is a rule that has been tuned by someone who has watched both legitimate and malicious behavior and understand what distinguishes them. Purple teaming produces that tuning data. It also validates that the detection rules are not just theoretically correct, but operationally effective, that they fire when a real attacker performs the technique in the real environment against the real configuration. Architecture, what designing from the inside out actually looks like. The architecture of an assumed breach environment has 4 layers, each of which addresses a different phase of the post-compromise kill chain. The first layer is containment architecture, the controls that limit how far an attacker can move once they have a foothold. Network microsegmentation is the primary instrument here. Where traditional segmentation creates broad zones, microsegmentation creates fine-grained policies that restrict communications between individual workloads or devices, not just between network zones. A policy that says the marketing team's workstations cannot initiate SMB connections to any system except the specific file server they are authorized to use is a microsegmentation policy. An attacker who compromises a marketing workstation and attempts to perform pass-the-hash attacks against other systems in the same network zone is blocked before those attacks can succeed, because the SMB connections to unauthorized destinations are denied at the policy level. The second layer is deception architecture, the controls that reveal the attacker's presence at the moment they begin exploring the internal environment. Honeypots and canary tokens are the instruments here. A honeypot is a fake server, service, or resource that looks real and attractive, but is not used by any legitimate employee. Any connection to it, any authentication attempt against it, any access to a file on it, is by definition malicious. Legitimate users have no reason to be there. The alert generated by honeypot interaction has an extremely high signal-to-noise ratio because there is no legitimate population of activity to confuse with the attacker. The honeypot alert is not one of 500 alerts requiring triage. It is one of one. A canary token is a more granular version of the same concept. A credential that is placed in a location where an attacker performing credential harvesting is likely to find it, but that is not valid for any real system. When an attacker attempts to use the harvested credential, the authentication attempt fails in a way that generates a specific alert. A credential file placed in a directory that legitimate users never access, containing a username and password that map to a monitored honeypot authentication endpoint, is a canary token that fires the moment the attacker reaches that directory and tests the credential. The alert provides not just notification of attacker presence, but also location in the attack chain. The attacker has progressed to credential harvesting, which narrows the investigation to the systems and time window relevant to that stage. The third layer is behavioral detection, the controls that identify attacker techniques being executed by tools and accounts that are already trusted. This is the domain of behavioral EDR and internal IDS rules, and it is the hardest layer to get right because it requires distinguishing attacker behavior from legitimate behavior that looks superficially similar. The canonical examples of living off the land techniques, using built-in Windows tools like PowerShell, WMI, and MSHDA to execute malicious actions rather than dropping external malware, are difficult to detect at the tool level because the tools themselves are legitimate. The detection must operate at the behavior level, not PowerShell ran, but PowerShell ran, encoded a command, connected to an IP that has no DNS record, established a persistent connection, and did this from a parent process that is a Microsoft Office application. That pattern, assembled from multiple observable attributes, is the detection. The fourth layer is resilience architecture, the controls that ensure the organization can survive and recover even if containment and detection fail and the attacker reaches their objective. Immutable backups are the primary instrument here. An immutable backup is a backup that cannot be modified or deleted by any account, including administrator accounts, for the duration of its retention period. Ransomware that compromises administrator credentials and deletes or encrypts backup copies. A standard behavior in modern ransomware campaigns specifically designed to eliminate the recovery option cannot reach an immutable backup because the immutability is enforced at the storage layer, below the operating system and below the application layer, where the compromised account operates. The architecture of the backup system matters as much as the immutability property. The 3-2-1 rule, 3 copies of the data on 2 different media types with 1 copy offsite, is the minimum standard. Offsite means genuinely offsite, A backup that lives in the same cloud account as the primary infrastructure is reachable by an attacker who has compromised that cloud account's credentials. True separation requires a separate account with separate credentials that are not stored anywhere accessible to the primary environment, and immutability settings that the account owner cannot modify without a time delay and multi-party approval. Tools that enforce the philosophy for instruments of inside-out defense. 4 tools define the operational implementation of assumed breach, and each one addresses a different gap that the perimeter model leaves open. Microsegmentation software, whether implemented through software-defined networking platforms, host-based firewalling at the workload level, or eBPF-based enforcement at the kernel, provides the containment layer that network segmentation describes at the macro level. The benefit is blast radius control. An attacker who compromises one workload cannot reach any workload that the microsegmentation policy does not explicitly permit. The cost is policy management at scale. A large enterprise with thousands of workloads and dozens of approved communication patterns requires a policy management system that can represent those patterns clearly, enforce them consistently across environments, and update them without manual intervention when workloads are provisioned or decommissioned. A microsegmentation deployment that becomes unmanageable is one that accumulates exceptions, rules added to make things work when the policy blocks something it should not, until the exception set is larger than the allow list and the policy no longer represents the intended containment architecture. The blind spot is lateral movement that uses permitted communication channels. An attacker who understands that the workstation segment is permitted to reach the web proxy can use that permitted channel for C2 communication, because the microsegmentation policy allows the connection and sees only that it is using an approved path. A behavioral EDR, CrowdStrike, Microsoft Defender for Endpoint, SentinelOne, and their equivalents, provides the detection layer that signature-based antivirus cannot. Where a signature engine looks for known bad files, a behavioral engine observes what processes do, what they read, what they write, what network connections they create, what child processes they spawn, and whether that pattern of behavior matches known attacker techniques mapped to MITRE, ATT, and CK. The benefit is detection of novel malware and living off the land attacks that have no signature because they use no custom tooling. The cost is false positives, behavioral rules that are sensitive enough to catch sophisticated attacker behavior are also sensitive enough to flag legitimate administrative behavior that resembles it. The tuning discipline, iterative adjustment of detection thresholds using Purple Team exercise data and analyst feedback, is an ongoing operational investment. The blind spot is the attacker who operates entirely within the behavioral baseline, who moves slowly enough that no single action triggers a behavioral rule, whose access patterns are consistent with the compromised account's legitimate behavior, and who operates during the hours and at the rate that the account normally operates. Honeypots and canary tokens provide deception layer detection that complements behavioral detection by targeting the reconnaissance phase rather than the execution phase. The behavioral EDR detects the attacker doing something malicious. The honeypot detects the attacker looking for something to be malicious with. These are different points in the attack chain, and detecting at the earlier point gives the responder more time and more options. The benefit is the signal quality. Every honeypot interaction is a true positive by definition. The cost is deployment and maintenance. Honeypots that look obviously fake, services with no legitimate traffic history, credentials that have never been used for anything, are detectable by sophisticated attackers who perform operational security checks before interacting with Discover resources. High-fidelity honeypots require enough realism to fool an attacker who is looking for deception. Plausible names, consistent traffic patterns, and credentials that appear to have been used in the environment rather than freshly generated. The blind spot is the attacker who recognizes the honeypot and avoids it, which is itself a signal that the attacker is operating with above-average awareness of defensive techniques. Immutable backup infrastructure provides the resilience layer that makes recovery possible when everything else fails. The benefit is independence from the compromised environment. Even if the attacker has domain administrator credentials and has encrypted every accessible file system, the immutable backup is outside the blast radius and the data it contains is intact. The cost is the operational complexity of maintaining truly separate credentials, ensuring that backup integrity is regularly tested by performing actual restores rather than just verifying that the backup process completed, and managing the retention period and storage cost of an immutable store that cannot be deleted on demand. The critical limitation is restore time. An immutable backup that is perfectly intact but requires 72 hours to restore is not a business continuity solution for a financial institution that processes millions of transactions per day. The RTO, recovery time objective, the maximum acceptable time to restore normal operation, must be matched against the actual restore capacity of the backup architecture before the incident, not estimated during the incident. The blind spot is data that was never included in the backup scope. The cloud SaaS application whose data was not in the backup policy. The developer's local repository that contained work-in-progress code. The network-attached storage appliance that was added to the environment after the backup scope was last reviewed. Implementation. Building the inside-out defense in two scenarios. Two implementation scenarios ground the architecture in operational reality, because the gap between drawing a micro-segmentation diagram and actually deploying one that works without breaking production is where the principle gets tested. The first scenario is deploying an internal IDS to detect lateral movement. The placement question comes first. A perimeter IDS placed at the network edge sees traffic entering and leaving the network. It is completely blind to traffic flowing between devices inside the network, which is exactly where lateral movement occurs. An internal IDS must be placed where it can see east-west traffic, either inline between network segments, receiving traffic from span ports on the core switching infrastructure, or deployed as host-based sensors on the systems being monitored. The choice between these deployment models depends on the network architecture and the sensitivity of the segments being monitored. The signatures and behavioral rules for lateral movement detection are different from those for perimeter intrusion detection. The patterns to look for include SMB authentication attempts from workstations to servers or other workstations, which is unusual in a normally configured environment where workstation-to-workstation lateral movement is not a legitimate use case. Kerberos ticket requests for services that the requesting account does not normally access, which indicates either Kerberosing or the early stages of credential-based lateral movement. RDP connections are originating from systems that are not in the management network, which indicates an attacker using remote desktop to hop between compromised systems. WMIC and PS exec invocations originating from non-management workstations, which are tools commonly used in lateral movement and almost never used by ordinary employees in normal operation. Each of these patterns requires a different data source. SMB authentication events come from Windows security event logs. Kerberos ticket requests come from domain controller logs. RDP connections come from both Windows event logs and network flow data. WMIC invocations come from Sysmon process creation events. Building lateral movement detection requires all of these sources to be present, normalized, and correlated in the same platform, which reinforces the SIEM build discipline described in the previous session. Detection is only as good as the telemetry it operates on. The PEM implementation addresses a specific and frequently exploited gap in the assumed breach architecture: privileged credentials. An attacker who obtains a standard user credential can reach only the resources that user is authorized to access. An attacker who obtains a domain administrator credential can reach everything. Privileged access management closes this gap by ensuring that privileged credentials are never exposed to the systems where they could be harvested. Administrators do not know the actual password for privileged accounts. They request access through the PAM vault, which authenticates them, applies approval workflows where required, checks out the credential on their behalf, and injects it into the session. The credential is never displayed in clear text. The administrator cannot copy it. When the session ends, the PAM system rotates the credential automatically, which means that even if the attacker extracted the credential from memory during the session, it is no longer valid by the time they attempt to use it. Session recording is the accountability component of PEM. Every privileged session, every action taken by every administrator using a vaulted credential, is recorded as a keystroke log and optionally as a video replay, indexed and stored in a tamper-resistant repository. The recording serves two purposes. First, it is a deterrent. Administrators who know that every action they take is recorded and reviewable are less likely to take actions they should not. Second, it is a forensic resource. When investigating a breach where a privileged account was involved, the session recordings provide an authoritative record of exactly what was done, in what sequence, without dependence on the integrity of logs that the attacker may have modified. The limitation of session recording is that it records what was done, not whether it was authorized. An attacker using a legitimate credential will have their actions recorded exactly as a legitimate administrator would. The recording is evidence, but it requires a forensic investigator who understands the context to determine whether the recorded session represents legitimate maintenance or malicious action. When Inside Out fails, 3 scenarios diagnosed. 3 troubleshooting scenarios reveal how assumed breach architecture fails in practice and what the diagnostic process looks like when a threat has already moved inside the perimeter. The first scenario is the workstation showing signs of botnet infection. Outbound C2 connections on port 443 to a known malicious IP. Beaconing at regular intervals, an unusual process behavior that the EDR has flagged but not automatically remediated. The dual imperative here: isolate the workstation to stop the C2 communication while preserving the forensic evidence that exists in its running memory, is the defining tension of the assumed breach response posture. The isolation step is network-based, not host-based, for a specific reason. An attacker who has achieved sufficient access to the endpoint may have the capability to detect and respond to a host-based isolation command, potentially triggering destructive actions on the endpoint before the isolation completes. Network-level isolation, implemented through a NAC quarantine policy, a VLAN reassignment, or an EDR-initiated network isolation command that operates at the kernel level below the attacker's reach, takes effect without the attacker being able to observe or respond to it in the user space environment where their malware is running. The workstation can no longer reach the C2 server. The malware continues running in memory, where it is now available for forensic analysis, but cannot receive instructions or exfiltrate further data. The memory acquisition happens immediately after isolation, before any remediation action that might overwrite or clear the memory. A memory forensics tool, run from a trusted external binary, because running software from the infected system risks using compromised binaries, acquires a complete image of physical memory, which contains the running malware process, its command and control traffic in the network stack buffers, any decoded payloads it has decompressed or decrypted into memory, and potentially the encryption keys or configuration data for its communication protocol. This is the evidence that will allow the threat intelligence analyst to characterize the malware, identify the campaign it belongs to, and determine whether additional systems in the environment may be similarly compromised. The second scenario is ransomware that has encrypted the primary file shares, and the backup restoration has failed because the backups were also encrypted. The diagnostic must address two questions simultaneously. How do we recover the data, and how do we understand what happened in order to stop it from happening again before we bring systems back online? The backup failure investigation begins with the timeline. When were the backups last successfully completed? When were the backups last verified by a restore test? When did the ransomware begin encrypting files? And was that time before or after the last successful backup? If the last successful backup predates the ransomware deployment by weeks, the attacker may have compromised the backup infrastructure as a preparatory step before triggering the encryption, specifically to eliminate the recovery option. Pull the backup management console logs for the weeks preceding the encryption event. Look for credential changes, configuration changes, retention policy modifications, backup deletions, or access events from accounts that should not be accessing the backup management console. The attacker's preparation for the backup elimination is almost always logged somewhere. The question is whether the logs were retained and whether the activity was reviewed when it occurred. The resilience redesign that prevents recurrence addresses the three properties that the original backup architecture lacked. The first is immutability. Backup data cannot be modified or deleted by any account during the retention period. The second is separation. The backup infrastructure is accessed using credentials that are not stored anywhere in the primary environment. So an attacker who compromises the primary environment cannot reach the backup credentials without a separate compromise. The third is verified recoverability. Backup completeness and restore speed are tested on a schedule that is frequent enough to detect problems before an incident makes the backup the only path to recovery. A backup that has never been restored from is a theory, not a recovery plan. The third scenario is the C2 beacon on port 443 from an internal host, detected by the CM correlation rule that fires when internal host makes repeated, timed outbound connections to an IP that appears in the threat intelligence feed as a known command and control endpoint. The SOC analyst who receives this alert must execute the contain and eradicate plan while simultaneously maintaining enough evidence integrity to support a post-incident investigation. The containment phase begins before the investigation, because every minute the beacon is active is a minute the attacker may be receiving instructions or staging an additional action. Network isolation of the source host, as described in the previous scenario, is the first action. But in this scenario, the beacon is on port 443, which means the traffic is TLS encrypted, which means the CM correlation rule fired on the destination IP and the timing pattern, not on the content of the communication. The investigation must treat this as a high-confidence detection that the host is communicating with a known bad destination, without yet knowing what the communication contains. The EDR telemetry from the host will show which process is making the connection. If it is a browser process initiated by user activity, the scenario is different from a system process making connections with no user interaction. System process beaconing with no user-initiated trigger is a strong indicator of malware rather than a user browsing to a compromised site. The eradication phase begins after the forensic acquisition and the scope assessment. Scope assessment answers the question of whether this is an isolated endpoint compromise or whether the attacker has moved laterally to additional systems. Review the internal network traffic log for the period between the likely initial compromise and the detection event. Are there SMB authentication attempts from the compromised host to other systems? Are there unusual RDP connections? Are there Kerberos ticket requests for services that the account on the compromised host would not normally access? If the scope is limited to the one host, the eradication is a full reimage from a known good baseline. If lateral movement is confirmed, the eradication plan must sequence the isolation and re-imaging of each compromised system in a way that does not alert the attacker to the response before all compromised systems are simultaneously isolated. The coordination requirement involving IT, network engineering, and management before executing the eradication is not bureaucratic overhead. It is the operational necessity of ensuring that every team that manages a piece of infrastructure the eradication depends on is ready to execute their part at the same time. An eradication plan that isolates the primary compromised host but does not simultaneously act on the additional systems the attacker moved to give the attacker time to entrench further in the systems that were not yet touched. 3 roles in the post-exploitation landscape they each navigate. The detection engineer's defining moment in an assumed breach environment is not the alert that fires. It is the gap, the attacker technique that was used that the detection rule library did not cover, that only became visible in the post-incident forensic analysis. Building a detection library for post-exploitation behavior is a fundamentally different discipline from building rules for perimeter intrusion, and the most instructive teachers are not threat intelligence reports, but post-incident investigations of what was missed. The command clustering pipeline is a detection engineer's answer to the problem that individual behavioral signatures are evadable, but behavioral patterns across sessions are not. An attacker who knows that a single PowerShell invocation with encoded arguments triggers a detection rule will modify their tooling to avoid that specific signature. An attacker who knows that their entire session, every command they run, every tool they invoke, every network connection they initiate, is being clustered against known attacker command sequences and compared against the behavioral baseline of legitimate users, is facing a detection approach that requires them to perfectly mimic legitimate behavior at every step, which is operationally expensive and frequently impossible. The pipeline design begins with log parsing to extract the command sequences from shell sessions and process execution logs, then applies a similarity algorithm, jacket distance on command n-grams, or cosine similarity on term frequency vectors of process names, to cluster sessions by their behavioral similarity to known attacker toolkits. Sessions that cluster near known malicious command sequences and far from the legitimate baseline for that user's role generate a detection event, not on any individual command, but on the aggregate pattern. The threat intelligence analyst in an assumed breach environment encounters the diamond model of intrusion analysis not as an academic framework, but as a practical tool for answering the question that matters most when the attacker is already inside. How are they getting from point A to point B? The Diamond model describes each intrusion event as a relationship between four vertices: adversary, infrastructure, capability, and victim. And the value of the model for inside-out defense is that it allows the analyst to predict the attacker's next move by understanding their infrastructure and capabilities, not just their current position. An SSH honeypot session that reveals a specific combination of SSH client fingerprint, command sequence, and downloaded binary allows the analyst to characterize the adversary's capability, this specific toolchain, and to query the threat intelligence database for other incidents where the same fingerprint and tool combination appeared. If 3 other victims in the same industry reported the same combination 3 months ago, the analyst now has a campaign context that tells them not just what the attacker did in this environment, but what the attacker did in other environments at a later stage in the intrusion, which is the most actionable intelligence for predicting what they will do next. The SOC analyst at L2 and L3 encounters the assumed breach posture most viscerally in the handover report problem. In a 24/7 operations environment, an analyst who is investigating an active incident hands the investigation to the next shift at the end of their rotation. The quality of that handover, the accuracy of the current scope assessment, the completeness of the forensic artifacts already collected, the clarity of the hypotheses being tested, determines whether the next analyst can pick up the investigation at the point where it was left or must restart from the beginning because the context in the handover report is insufficient. An incomplete handover in an active incident does not just slow the investigation. It creates a window during which the attacker continues operating while the incoming analyst reestablishes context that was already known to the outgoing analyst. The discipline of the shift handover report, written with the specificity needed by someone who is not in the room, covering the current scope, the current hypotheses, the actions already taken, the evidence already collected, and the next actions planned, is as important to the assumed breach response capability as the tools themselves. Case scenario: the law firm that planned for the inevitable. A 40-partner law firm manages litigation matters for clients in financial services and healthcare. Their data is a target: client privilege communications, medical records relevant to litigation, financial transaction histories, and strategy documents for ongoing cases. The firm's previous security investment had been almost entirely perimeter-focused. A next-generation firewall with advanced threat protection, an email gateway with sandboxing, and endpoint antivirus on all workstations. The internal network was flat. There were no behavioral detection rules for internal activity. Backup infrastructure shared credentials with the primary domain. The constraint that shapes the security program redesign is time and budget. The firm has 12 months and a security budget that represents 2% of revenue. Full zero trust deployment is not achievable in 12 months. Microsegmenting the entire internal network while maintaining the operational continuity of a busy litigation practice requires careful sequencing. The CISO, a role the firm has just hired for the first time, must design a phased implementation that produces the most meaningful reduction in blast radius within the budget and timeline available. The first priority is credential isolation for the most privileged accounts. The domain administrators and the partner-level users who have access to the client file servers represent the highest value targets in the environment. A PAM vault is deployed first, covering the 5 domain administrator accounts and the credentials for the backup management console. The backup management console credential is moved to a break glass account in the vault separated from the domain administrator credentials, and the backup infrastructure is moved to a separate management VLAN accessible only from the PAM vault. This single change eliminates the scenario where a compromised domain administrator credential can be used to access and destroy the backup infrastructure. The credential that previously provided this access no longer exists in the primary domain. The second priority is Canary token deployment. 12 Canary credentials are placed across the internal file server directories that contain client matter files, buried in document directories, named to look like service account configuration files containing credentials, formatted consistently with the legitimate configuration files in the same directory. Any authentication attempt using one of these credentials generates a high-priority alert that goes directly to the CISO's phone as well as to the SOC monitoring queue. The deployment takes 1 day and costs almost nothing. The detection value is significant. The first interaction with a Canary credential will tell the security team, with high confidence, that an attacker has compromised a workstation, has gained access to the file server directories, and is performing credential harvesting, all before the attacker has taken any further action against the client data. The third priority is behavioral detection for lateral movement. The firm deploys Sysmon on all domain-joined workstations and servers and configures Windows event forwarding to send process creation, network connection, and Kerberos ticket events to a SIEM. 2 detection rules are built and tested using Purple Team methodology before being placed in production. The first fires when a workstation initiates an SMB connection to another workstation, a communication pattern that has no legitimate use case in a law firm environment and is the canonical signal of lateral movement. The second fires when a PowerShell process is spawned by a Microsoft Office application, the pattern of a malicious macro executing a PowerShell payload, and makes an outbound network connection in the same session. Both rules are validated against the Purple Team's simulation exercises before production deployment to confirm they fire on attacker behavior and do not fire on the IT team's legitimate administrative scripts. 3 months into the new security posture, a partner's laptop is compromised by a zero-click exploit delivered through a malicious PDF received during a deposition scheduling exchange. The exploit is a commercial-grade tool targeting a known but unpatched vulnerability in the PDF reader. The attacker's intent is to move from the partner's laptop to the client file server and exfiltrate materials relevant to a financial services litigation matter that a competitor is interested in. The NDR sensor placed on the core switch detects an ARP sweep from the partner's laptop 40 minutes after the initial compromise. The malware is mapping the local subnet looking for reachable devices. The NDR alert fires as a medium-severity event in the SIEM. 40 seconds later, the Canary credential in the client files directory is authenticated against the domain controller. The attacker has found a harvested credential and is testing it. This second alert fires as high severity and goes directly to the CISO's phone. The SOC analyst receiving the 2 correlated alerts, ARP sweep from a specific workstation, followed by Canary credential authentication from the same workstation, executes the network isolation playbook. The partner's laptop is isolated at the NAC level within 90 seconds of the Canary alert. The SMB connection to the client file server is never established. The microsegmentation policy that was deployed the previous month as part of the phased rollout would have blocked the connection anyway. The workstation segment does not permit direct SMB connections to the client file server, which is in a separately managed segment. but the network isolation happens first. The partner is in a client meeting. The IT team issues a loaner laptop and migrates the partner's session within 2 hours. The forensic acquisition of the compromised laptop occurs during the meeting. Memory is imaged, the malicious process is characterized, and the PDF that delivered the exploit is identified in the download history. The threat intelligence analyst correlates the PDF exploit fingerprint against the threat intelligence feed and identifies it as belonging to a commercial exploit kit that has been used in 3 other law firm targeting campaigns in the previous 6 months. The campaign context suggests the attacker's lateral movement objective was specifically the client file server, which is consistent with the ARP sweep having targeted that server's IP range. The incident is contained to 1 laptop. Client data is not accessed. The attacker's presence in the environment lasted 40 minutes before isolation. The 40 minutes of dwell time in a firm that planned for the inevitable produced no meaningful damage because every control the attacker encountered was designed to limit blast radius rather than to prevent the initial entry that the firm had correctly assumed would eventually succeed. Closing, building for the day after. Security that is designed only to prevent the initial breach has a single point of failure: the attacker's first successful action. When that action succeeds, and eventually it will, because the attacker can choose the time, the method, and the target, and they need to be right once while the defender must be right every time, everything downstream of that first breach depends on what was built before it happened. Assume breach is not pessimism. It is the design discipline that treats breach as a planning constraint rather than a catastrophic exception. Every architectural decision made under this principle asks the same question. If an attacker is already here, what does this control do for us? The segmentation rule that stops lateral movement. The canary token that tells us the attacker is in the file server directory. The immutable backup that survives the ransomware deployment. The PM vault that rotates the credential before the attacker can use it a second time. None of these controls prevent the attacker from getting in. All of them determine what the attacker can accomplish after they arrive. The posture this principle produces is one of continuous, deliberate reduction of what an attacker can achieve from any given foothold. The blast radius of any single compromise is contained. The dwell time before detection is shortened. The recovery time after eradication is bounded. The organization does not become unbreachable. No organization can be. It becomes resilient, able to absorb the hit that cannot be avoided, contain the damage, eject the attacker, and restore normal operation without the incident becoming the story that defines the firm for a decade. That is the difference between a security program that was built to keep attackers out and one that was built for the day after they got in.